I still don't know how the man in the woods knew my name before I ever spoke to him. That's the part I can't explain away, even after everything else eventually made sense. If you'd asked me that morning, I would have laughed if someone told me I'd spend the next 12 hours convinced I wasn't going to make it home. I wasn't hiking alone because I wanted adventure. I was there because I needed a break from work. My company had switched everyone to remote after the pandemic, and by the fall of 2024, I felt like my apartment walls were closing in. I booked a small cabin near a state forest in western North Carolina for a long weekend, figuring I'd spend a couple of days hiking, reading, and staying off my phone. The first trail was almost empty. I passed an older couple walking back toward the parking lot, then a guy jogging with headphones. After that, I didn't see anyone for nearly an hour. Around noon, I stopped near a creek to eat a sandwich. That's when I heard someone behind me. David. Just one word. My name. Not shouted, almost conversational. I turned around expecting another hiker. Nobody. Only trees. I actually smiled to myself. I figured someone nearby was talking to someone else. Then I heard it again. David. Closer this time. I stood up. Hello? Nothing. The woods went completely quiet. No birds, no footsteps. Just the creek. I waited another minute before convincing myself I'd imagined the distance wrong. Sound carries strangely in forests. Someone on another trail could have been calling for a friend. That explanation worked for about 15 minutes. Then I found the first note. It was folded neatly under a rock beside the trail. I almost ignored it, assuming it was trash. Instead, I picked it up. Inside were 4 handwritten words. You should turn back. No signature, no joke. Just those words. I looked around expecting hidden cameras or teenagers trying to scare hikers. Nothing. I laughed nervously and stuffed the note into my pocket. Looking back, that was the moment I should have gone back to my car. Instead, I kept walking, because people hate admitting they're scared for no reason. About another mile down the trail, I caught movement between the trees. Someone standing behind a cluster of pines. He wasn't hiding exactly, just watching. He wore a faded green jacket, jeans, and a dark baseball cap, too far away to see his face. When I looked directly at him, he stepped behind a tree. I waited. Nothing. I walked another 100 yards before looking back. He was there again, same distance, standing still, watching. I told myself he was another hiker. Maybe he'd stopped to rest. Maybe I was making myself paranoid because of the note. Still, I picked up my pace. About 20 minutes later, I reached a fire road that connected back toward the parking area. A park ranger truck was parked nearby. I actually felt relieved. The ranger was leaning against the truck drinking coffee. I told him someone seemed to be following me. He listened politely. Did he threaten you? No. Say anything? No. You sure he's following you? I think so. He nodded toward the woods. Probably another hiker. Happens all the time. If he bothers you again, come back. That was it. No report, no questions, nothing. I almost felt embarrassed. So I thanked him and headed back toward the trail. I never saw the ranger again. Later I learned he'd left less than 5 minutes after I walked away. Around 3 that afternoon, I decided to head back to the parking lot. Only when I reached it, my rental SUV was the only vehicle left. Except something was wrong. Every door was unlocked. I knew I'd locked it. The glove compartment was open. Nothing looked stolen. Wallet, laptop bag, camera. Everything was still there. I searched the whole vehicle. Then I noticed something sitting on the driver's seat. Another folded note. This one said, "You don't listen very well, David. I didn't care anymore." I got in, locked the doors, started the engine, and drove straight back toward the cabin. The entire drive I kept checking my mirrors. No one followed me. At least I didn't think so. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road surrounded by thick trees. Exactly what I'd wanted 2 days earlier. Now it felt isolated in the worst possible way. I called my sister just to hear another voice. No signal. The cabin Wi-Fi was down. A storm had rolled through earlier that afternoon, and apparently the internet was out across the area. I figured I'd drive into town after dinner. Instead, it started raining hard enough that visibility disappeared. I decided I'd leave first thing in the morning. That night I locked every door. Around 10 I heard footsteps outside, slow, crunching across wet gravel. I froze. The footsteps stopped outside the front porch. No knock, nothing. Just silence. I turned off every light, peeked through a gap in the curtains. A man stood near my truck, same green jacket, same baseball cap. He wasn't trying to break in, he was simply looking at the house. Then he walked back into the trees. I grabbed my keys intending to leave anyway. The truck wouldn't start, the battery was dead. That made no sense. It had been fine an hour earlier. I sat there trying again. Nothing. Rain hammered the windshield. That's when my headlights flashed once by themselves. Then, everything went dark. I got out. The hood was slightly open. When I lifted it, the battery cables had been disconnected. Not damaged, disconnected. Someone wanted me stuck there. I reconnected them with shaking hands. The truck started immediately. Before I could back out, headlights appeared at the end of the gravel road. Another pickup. It stopped. Didn't move. Just idled. I couldn't see who was inside because of the rain. I waited. It waited. 5 minutes passed. Then the pickup slowly backed away until the headlights disappeared. I left anyway. Halfway to town, I passed that same pickup parked on the shoulder. Empty. No driver. I didn't stop. The sheriff's office was closed for the night except for dispatch. A deputy took my statement. He asked if I'd argued with anyone recently, had an ex-girlfriend, work problems, debt, anything. I said no. He wrote everything down, then asked the question I wasn't expecting. Who else knew you were staying at that cabin? My family? Friends? A few co-workers? He nodded. Sometimes these things aren't random. That sentence stayed with me. The next morning I packed everything before sunrise. As I loaded the truck, I noticed muddy footprints around the cabin, not just near the porch, around every single window. Someone had walked circles around the house for hours. Inside the trash can by the road was an empty bottle of water. Fresh. Not mine. I drove home. For 2 weeks nothing happened. I convinced myself whoever it was had gotten bored. Then my neighbor called while I was at work. There was some guy asking about you. What guy? Said he was an old friend. What did he look like? She paused. Green jacket. Every hair on my arm stood up. I called the police again. This time, they took it more seriously. An investigator asked for every detail, especially the notes and especially the fact that the man knew my name. Then he asked something strange. Did you post photos from the trip? No. Did the cabin owner? I don't think so. He nodded but didn't explain. A week later, they called me back. They'd identified the man, not because of me, but because another family had reported nearly the exact same thing. Different forest, different state, same behavior, watching, notes, never attacking, learning names first. His real name wasn't important. He'd been arrested years earlier for stalking multiple strangers. He picked victims by searching vacation rental websites and social media. People shared everything: cabin names, travel dates, photos, even first names. Sometimes rental hosts accidentally displayed guest names publicly through reviews or welcome messages. He built entire profiles before ever meeting people. That's how he knew my name. He'd probably known where I worked too. The investigator believed he'd entered my unlocked rental while I was hiking. Not to steal. To make sure I'd noticed the note. Fear was the point. He enjoyed watching people slowly realize they weren't alone. But there was one detail they couldn't explain. I'd never posted anything about that trip. No pictures, no check-ins, nothing. The cabin owner hadn't either. The investigator eventually discovered the booking confirmation I'd forwarded to a co-worker weeks earlier. That co-worker used the same outdoor photography form as the stalker. He'd posted screenshots showing cabins he wanted to visit someday. My confirmation email, with my first name visible in the corner, was accidentally included in one image. The screenshot stayed online for less than an hour before being deleted, but it was long enough for the wrong person to save it. That tiny mistake gave him my name, my travel dates, and the exact cabin. He didn't randomly find me in the woods. He'd been waiting for me to arrive. Police searched his storage unit after his arrest. They found folders, hundreds of them, maps, printed booking confirmations, photographs of cabins, license plate numbers, handwritten schedules, victims from at least 7 states. Most never knew how much information he'd collected. Some never realized they'd been watched at all. The investigator told me something I'll never forget. If he'd wanted to hurt you, he probably would have. His goal wasn't murder. It was control. He wanted people to feel unsafe everywhere afterward, and he succeeded. It's been almost 2 years. I don't post vacation plans anymore. I never tag locations until I'm already home. If I rent a cabin, I use a different name whenever it's legally allowed. I keep my curtains closed at night. I installed security cameras around my apartment. Most people think that's excessive. Maybe it is. But every now and then, I'll hear someone call my name in a crowded place just loudly enough to make me turn around. And for one split second, before I see an ordinary stranger talking to someone else, I'm back in those woods, wondering if the man behind the trees somehow found me again. The first time the man in the woods said my name, I thought he had to be talking to someone else. 5 minutes later, I realized there was no one else out there. I still replay that moment more than any other, because if I'd turned around and walked back to my truck right then, none of what happened afterward would have happened. Instead, I convinced myself I was overreacting. That's the lie I told myself over and over that weekend. My name is Ethan, and this happened in October of 2023, while I was camping alone in the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Tennessee. I wasn't some experienced outdoorsman. I worked in IT, spent most of my life behind a desk, and only started hiking after my doctor told me I needed to get outside more. I rented a small campsite inside a national forest for 2 nights because I wanted a quiet weekend away from my phone and work. Cell service was already weak by the time I reached the ranger station. The woman behind the desk handed me a paper map and smiled. "You're at Site 18, she said. "Only one other campsite is occupied on that side of the forest, about a mile away." That sounded perfect. I reached the site just before sunset. It was exactly what I wanted. A small clearing surrounded by tall hardwood trees, an old fire ring, a wooden picnic table, and a narrow trail leading to a creek about 200 yards away. The nearest road was far enough away that I couldn't hear traffic. That first evening was peaceful. I cooked a simple dinner, watched the fire burn down, and crawled into my tent around 10. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps. Slow. Crunch, pause, crunch. They stopped outside my tent. I held my breath. Maybe it was a deer, maybe a raccoon. Then I heard someone clear their throat. A man. "Ethan!" My eyes snapped open. My heart immediately started racing. Nobody I knew had any reason to be there. I didn't answer. For almost 30 seconds, there was complete silence. Then the footsteps slowly moved away toward the trees. I stayed awake until sunrise. By morning, I had almost convinced myself I'd dreamed it. Sleep does strange things when you're alone in unfamiliar places. I unzipped the tent expecting to find nothing unusual. Instead, I found fresh boot prints circling my campsite. They weren't mine. The tread pattern was completely different from my hiking boots. They started near the trail, circled my tent twice, stopped beside the picnic table, then disappeared back into the woods. I followed them for about 50 feet before losing them on rocky ground. Every instinct told me to pack up and leave. Instead, I made coffee and tried to explain it away. Maybe another camper had gotten lost during the night. Maybe someone had been looking for the trail. Around 9 that morning, I hiked to the creek. About halfway there, I noticed a man standing across the water. He was probably in his late 50s with gray hair sticking out beneath a faded camouflage cap. He wore an old brown hunting jacket, even though hunting season hadn't started yet. He wasn't holding a fishing rod or backpack. He just stood there watching the current. I nodded politely. "Morning?" He slowly looked at me and smiled. "Beautiful day, Ethan." Every muscle in my body tightened. I had never seen him before. I forced a laugh. "Have we met?" He didn't answer the question. He looked upstream for a few seconds, then said, "You shouldn't stay here tonight." Before I could respond, he turned and walked into the trees. I hurried across the creek to follow him, but by the time I reached the other side, he was gone. The forest wasn't dense enough for someone to disappear that quickly. I searched for nearly 10 minutes without finding another footprint or hearing another sound. That's when I decided to report it to the ranger station. When I arrived, the same woman was behind the counter. I described the man as best I could. She frowned. "Are you sure he knew your name?" "Positive." She asked to see my campsite permit. My first name, Ethan, was printed in large letters across the top. "Did you leave this sitting out?" she asked. I looked down. It was clipped to the outside of my cooler, exactly where campers were instructed to display it. My stomach dropped. Anyone walking through my campsite could have read it without getting close. That explanation should have made me feel better. It didn't. It only meant the man had been close enough to my campsite during the night to read my permit while I was asleep. The ranger offered to move me to another campsite closer to the entrance, but by then, my pride had gotten in the way. I thanked her and told her I was probably overthinking it. She reminded me to keep my food locked up, stay on marked trails, and come back immediately if the man bothered me again. I drove back to Site 18 telling myself that was exactly what I'd do. For the next few hours, everything felt normal. I ate lunch, read a book at the picnic table, and even started laughing at myself for getting worked up over an older guy who'd probably just wandered through my campsite. Around 3 that afternoon, I decided to hike a loop trail that climbed to an overlook about 2 miles away. About halfway up the trail, I noticed something that made me stop. Fresh boot prints. The same tread pattern I'd seen around my tent that morning. At first I figured they belonged to another hiker, but after another 15 minutes, I realized something strange. Every time I stopped to drink water or check the map, the tracks stopped too. They continued only after I started walking again. Someone wasn't just using the same trail. They were matching my pace. I spun around several times, but never saw anyone. The woods were quiet except for the wind moving through the leaves. I kept hiking anyway, telling myself I was letting fear invent patterns that weren't really there. When I finally reached the overlook, there was nobody else there. I stepped onto the wooden platform and looked out across miles of forest. It should have been relaxing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing just behind the tree line watching me. I stayed less than 2 minutes before turning back. On the return hike, I found a disposable coffee cup sitting in the middle of the trail. It hadn't been there earlier. Written across the lid with a black marker was a single word: Ethan. My stomach dropped. I didn't touch it. I took several pictures with my phone instead, then hurried back toward the parking area. By the time I reached it, the cup was the last thing on my mind. My driver's side door was slightly open. I knew I'd locked the truck. Nothing looked stolen at first. My wallet was still under the seat. My backpack was untouched. Then I noticed my camping map spread across the passenger seat. Someone had circled Site 18 with a red marker and written, "You should leave before dark." My hands started shaking. This wasn't someone playing a random prank anymore. Whoever it was had been inside my campsite, knew which vehicle was mine, and had somehow gotten into it. I drove straight back to the ranger station. This time, 2 rangers listened to everything. One of them asked to see the pictures of the coffee cup in the map. The other quietly made a phone call. They told me to stay inside the office while another ranger drove out to check my campsite. Nearly an hour passed before he returned. His face told me something was wrong before he even spoke. "Your tent's been cut open," he said. "Nothing appears to be stolen, but someone went through your gear." I remember asking the question that had been stuck in my head all day. "Was he still there?" The ranger shook his head. "No, but we found something." He placed a small spiral notebook on the counter. It wasn't mine. Inside were pages filled with handwritten notes, dates, times, vehicle descriptions, campsite numbers. Some entries went back almost 3 years. Then I saw my own name. October 14th, Site 18. Arrived 5:42 p.m. gray SUV, alone. Sleeps with lantern on until 11:08. I felt sick reading it. The notebook wasn't random. It was organized like a field journal. Every page documented someone different: families, couples, solo campers, license plate numbers, what they cooked, when they left their campsites, which trails they used, even small habits most people wouldn't notice. One page read, "Leaves cooler unlocked while hiking." Another said, "Usually walks dog at sunrise." Whoever wrote it had spent years quietly watching strangers. The ranger closed the notebook before I could read any more. "You're not staying here tonight," he said. They moved me into a staff cabin near the ranger station while the county sheriff's office came to collect evidence. I barely slept. Every sound outside made me think he'd found me again. Just after sunrise, a deputy asked me to walk him through everything from the moment I arrived. Halfway through the interview, another deputy walked in carrying a clear evidence bag. Inside was my campsite permit, the one that had been clipped to my cooler. Someone had removed it, folded it neatly, and placed it inside my sleeping bag after cutting open the tent. On the back, written in blue ink, were 6 words. "I told you to leave, Ethan." The deputies searched the surrounding woods for most of the day. Around noon, they found a hidden campsite less than half a mile from Site 18. It wasn't visible from any trail. A tarp had been stretched between trees, and underneath were canned food, water jugs, binoculars, batteries, camping gear, and dozens of notebooks just like the first one. There were also printed maps covered in handwritten markings. Some campsites had check marks beside them, others had names. Mine was circled. Then one of the deputies opened an old plastic storage container. Inside were hundreds of photographs. None of them looked staged. They were all taken from a distance with a zoom lens. People sitting around campfires, families cooking dinner, kids fishing, couples unloading their cars. Most of them had no idea they were being photographed. Then I found myself. There were pictures of me setting up my tent, pictures of me collecting firewood, pictures of me sleeping through the mesh window of my tent. One photo had been taken from less than 20 feet away while I was asleep. I couldn't stop staring at it. Someone had been standing close enough to hear me breathing. Late that afternoon, the deputies finally identified the man. He wasn't a drifter like everyone assumed. He lived alone about 30 miles away and had worked for years as a maintenance contractor for several campgrounds before retiring. He knew the trails better than the rangers. He knew where people usually camped and where they were most likely to feel safe. They arrested him the next morning after spotting his pickup truck outside a small grocery store. During questioning, he admitted to following campers for years, but insisted he never intended to physically hurt anyone. Detectives believed him. His obsession wasn't violence, it was control. He wanted people to know someone had been close enough to reach them whenever he wanted. Saying their names was his favorite part because it destroyed the feeling that they were anonymous in the wilderness. The investigation uncovered more than 200 notebooks dating back almost 15 years. Most victims never realized they'd been watched. Many of the names came from campsite permits, reservation tags, or conversations he quietly overheard while pretending to hike. I still think about how easily I dismissed those first warning signs. If I'd packed up after hearing my name outside the tent, I would have spent years wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. Instead, I learned just how vulnerable people really are when they believe they're completely alone. I still camp, but never by myself. I never leave my permit where anyone can read it, and I don't post photos until I'm back home. Every time I zip up a tent now, I take one last look into the trees before turning off the light. Because somewhere out there, there's probably another person who thinks they're alone, while someone they've never met already knows their name.